Dr. Tim's an assistant professor of exercise science and the program director of the Sport Physiology and Performance Coaching Master's Program at Carroll University in the US. His research interests include weightlifting movements and their derivatives, strength and power development, and athlete monitoring. Dr. Tim's published over 80 peer-reviewed journal articles on these topics and regularly presents at both the national and international level. In addition to his teaching and research, Tim also serves as a human performance coach and leads the athlete monitoring program at Carroll. He's a certified S&C specialist with distinction and a registered S&C coach through the National Strength and Conditioning Association, the NSCA, and serves as the chair of the NSCA's Sports Science and Performance Technology Special Interest Group. So a really nice blend of academic and applied knowledge and experience here. We're in for a real good one. Tim, really good morning and a really hearty welcome to you into Singapore virtually from the US. How are you doing this morning? Or is it be evening for you, is it?
It's evening, and it's an interesting day to say the least, primarily because we have our own election and everything going on right now. But yeah, I will say that it's a good time. You know, we're at 7:30 in the evening right now, so it's not too bad. But yeah, looking forward to having a good discussion this morning for you this evening.
Yeah. What, is it right? Do you go by the name of Tim or Timothy? What do you prefer?
I usually go with Tim.
Tim, okay, cool. All right. Hey, well, Tim, it's lovely to have you along. Really looking forward to this. I love strength. I love the topic. Really interested in it, although I'm a dietitian. But I love to be strong anyway. So really looking forward to listening to you. The floor is yours. I'll rejoin you at the wrap up, and we can have a chat about some questions and answers and go from there. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Awesome. Okay. Hey, thanks, Tim. Over to you.
All right, I will just share my screen here. All right, so as we were discussing a little bit, the overall topic of the conversation will be the importance of muscular strength for sport performance. And interestingly enough, you know, having given this opportunity by Danny Lum, I appreciate the opportunity, first of all, and thank the National Youth Sports Institute as well as Singapore Sport Institute for allowing me to come and give this talk. I think it's a really interesting topic, primarily because we think of strength as kind of something that may not necessarily need to be developed given the populations that we work with. However, we also have to consider its underpinnings and kind of where we are or how we're going to develop strength, because we can develop strength in a number of different ways. So things that we're going to be talking about here today is kind of defining what muscular strength actually is and discussing its underlying mechanisms. And specifically, we're going to talk about some hypertrophy as well as muscle architecture, but also some neuromechanisms. We're going to talk about really the impact that strength can have on performance and injury risk, some various training methods, but also throughout the presentation, I plan on giving a variety of practical examples of how to implement these training methods with your athletes. So let's get started. The one thing that I do have to address is the fact that there are a variety of coaches out there that, this one being a specific example with Mauricio Sarri, you know, if you just read the quote, it's kind of interesting to kind of put into perspective. It's all natural work we do in the gym. Nobody does weights. I've never seen a player with a weight on the pitch. So given the fact that this was a soccer or football manager, you really start to question if they understand kind of the physiology. And part of what we do with sports science is coach education. Because if you go through and actually do a little bit of reading, the most decisive actions in a sport like soccer are short sprints, jumps, tackles, dual play. All of these are anaerobic methods, and they're all strength power events. So as a result of that, we need to develop the characteristics that allow us to do well with that. Now, I'm sure some of you have heard something like this before, specifically from female athletes. Lifting weights is going to make me look like a bodybuilder. Well, interestingly enough, if we look into the science, naturally, women don't have the testosterone to be able to, quote unquote, look like a bodybuilder naturally. So what you end up getting when you end up putting women on a strength training program is you get a response like this. And this was an Instagram post from one of my volleyball players. And the other population that we may not necessarily talk about all that much is our distance athletes. In fact, if you go through and read this nice meta-analysis by Berryman, you're going to find out that it is a recommendation to do strength training with these athletes, primarily because if you think about what we're trying to develop with strength, how much force can we put into the ground? Are we going to be more efficient in our movements? Our running economy, is that going to improve? So just some things to consider here. Now, I do want to point out as well that this is a really good book if anyone else has had the opportunity to read it. But there's a quote that kind of stuck with me throughout this, and I've noticed that I've highlighted strength here a couple times. Unfortunately, as our profession has progressed to put a greater emphasis on movement, some coaches have minimized the value of strength in the overall development of the athlete. And what we as practitioners need to understand is we are, quote unquote, strength and conditioning coaches. So really what we're going to talk about is that development of strength. So we need to start with the original strength coach, as I like to say, Sir Isaac Newton. So Sir Isaac Newton, as you know, has these three laws of motion: law of inertia, law of acceleration, and law of action-reaction. But what many of you don't probably know is that Newton, under that long robe, was a beast. You know, you had all these muscles and everything because he understood these concepts of resistance. They understand the concepts of gravity. You know, all of us have been in the weight room one time or another and kind of gotten to the point where we start screaming, you know, Newton, because we can't beat the weights in the weight room. But we're going to touch on these laws of motion here briefly and why they are important to strength. So law of inertia, we know that a body at rest stays at rest until acted upon by an external force. So force is going to be highlighted here. So if we take this example, we obviously have a much larger kid running over a lot of smaller other kids when it comes to rugby here. So this is a law of inertia. Once this guy gets going, he may have to alter his movement a little bit, but he's going to be running over these other kids. If we move to the law of acceleration, we're talking about direction, or the proportion of forces impressed and the direction in which they are impressed. So the sum of forces, again, are going to be creating this acceleration. Now, the best part of this is, for the most part, the mass that we are moving, whether it's ourselves or whether it's going to be an external load, really doesn't change throughout the entire movement. And as a result, the sum of forces, i.e. greater forces, are going to produce greater accelerations. And lastly, action-reaction. If we're producing a force in one direction, we are going to receive that force in another direction. The way that we can kind of think about this is when we're running. So the more force that we put into a ground, i.e. the action, we get the reactive force that comes back. So some of you are probably sitting here thinking about, well, why should I care about this? This is physics, right? You're right, it is physics, but at the same time, we can define strength as the ability to produce force against an external resistance. And the reason why we can define it that way is because these external resistances can be several different things. First and foremost, we can classify an external resistance as an athlete's own body weight. So if we think about track and field sprinters, jumpers, they are successful if they can produce force against their body mass and move in space. Now, in terms of something like mixed martial arts, we need to move our own body mass plus our opponent's body mass. Now, whether we are striking, whether we are throwing our opponent, this is something that we have to take into consideration. We are on a mat, we are doing anything like MMA and UFC type of style. But also, we may be able to alter our body weight, but also an implement. So things like hockey, fencing, table tennis, where we have an implement in our hand or even with our feet, but we have to remember that the forces that we create are going to flow through our legs, through our torso, through our arms, to our wrists, essentially to our hands. So the ability to produce force against an external resistance is muscular strength. Now, why is it an ability? It is trainable. The best part of this is that anytime we're talking about force, it is trainable. We can get people stronger. Relative strength is going to be one of the most important things when it comes to developing other characteristics as well. So just to kind of illustrate this a little bit, we put together a paper that had a lot of correlation data in 2016. And the way to kind of think about this is that the strength is kind of our sun in our solar system. But different characteristics, if we look at large relationships, and I realize certainly that correlation does not equal causation, but if all of the relationship data trends the same direction, there's probably something to it. Strength showed 75%, 65% with rate of force development and power. So greater strength typically results in greater rate of force development and greater power. In terms of our general sporting abilities, jumping, sprinting, change of direction, stronger people seem to perform better. In terms of actual sport performance, this had to do with some track cycling, sprinting, etc. 83% of these correlations showed large relationships. But we also have to realize that there's additional things that we can get with strength as well. And we'll talk about injury potential here in a minute, but we'll also talk about potentiation in terms of using that as a training strategy. If we go through the literature and we actually look between stronger individuals and weaker individuals, what we're going to find is that stronger individuals typically jump higher or farther, they can sprint faster, and they can perform change of direction tasks better. Part of this has to do, again, with their ability to produce force, dynamic force, or even isometric and eccentric force when we're talking about change of direction and sprinting. If you look at the actual sport comparisons, you can see regardless of the sporting activity, we seem to see the common trend. Stronger individuals are going to perform better. So the take-home message of this literature is get stronger. Now, I know that may seem simplistic. There are better ways to do it than others, and we are going to be talking about several of those. So how about injury risk? There's a handful of papers that have come out, and a couple of these were meta-analyses by Lorison. And interestingly enough, what we're going to see is how does it affect injury risk, number one? How does the dose response relate to that as well? But what you're going to find with these bottom two papers in terms of by Malone and Case is people are starting to put together, researchers, practitioners are starting to put together actual standards of relative strength that may contribute or mitigate the risk of injury. So what we see with this literature is both of these meta-analyses is they found rather, that strength training reduced sports injuries to less than a third, but overuse injuries to almost half. Now, the sample size of this meta-analysis was massive. You know, sometimes we're just happy as researchers to get 15 people over here in the United States. But at the same time, when you do a meta-analysis, you can get a lot more in terms of your N. The other thing that we saw is about a 10% increase in resistance training volume decreased injury occurrence by about 4.3%. So taking a population that typically doesn't do resistance training and adding a little volume to their resistance training, or at least doing more resistance training, is going to be beneficial. We actually had a situation with our volleyball team when I was a doctoral student that they had a really high injury rate. And what we ended up doing was taking part of their practice time and getting them into the weight room during that practice time. And what we saw is their winning percentage went up and their injury rate went down. So something to be said there. Now, what you're going to see with this Malone paper is they started to establish strength standards. So what this is a trap bar deadlift, also known as a hex bar deadlift. In terms of relative strength, what they had as kind of a reference point was 3 times their body weight. Now, I don't expect every single athlete to be able to hex bar deadlift or trap bar deadlift 3 times their body weight. That's pretty significant. But what they ended up seeing here is a trend that the weaker the individual got, the greater the odds were that they may have been injured. And what we ended up seeing with a recent paper by Case is that football players, American football players who squatted less than 2.2 times their body weight or less than 1.6 times the body mass for women who were volleyball players and softball players may actually see an increased injury risk. Now, before everyone starts to say, well, I need to reach these standards of strength, these standards of strength are specific to the population. In terms of the case paper, these were Division I high caliber athletes. It's not to say that other athletes can't get there, but you also have to consider the fact that every athlete has a given relative strength that should be specific to their sport, and we'll talk about that more. All right, so now we've gotten to this point that I believe I've made enough of a case to you that strength is going to be important, but now how do we get stronger? And the way to look at this is starting from a physiological perspective. The underlying factors of strength include things like muscle size, muscle architecture, as well as neurological factors. So when we're thinking about gaining strength, we need to think about possibly developing hypertrophy first. We'll talk about some Titan adaptations, but if you think about the neural factors that we have here, in addition to motor programs and developing motor programs, is that there are certain exercise stimuli that you can give an individual to benefit these characteristics more and more. So starting with hypertrophy. Now, if you go back to 1967, Morehouse and Miller, the idea was if we're going to develop hypertrophy prior to strength, the goal here is ultimately to obtain, quote, a larger engine in which we can deliver force and muscular work. So what this is doing is hypertrophy is kind of laying the foundation for strength. And the way that we do this is based on the type of hypertrophy that we develop. Now, there recently has been some controversy whether hypertrophy is actually going to benefit strength performance. So recent discussions with Hornsby, Lonneke, what you're going to end up seeing is that mixed literature. Now, admittedly, some of the literature by Lonneke's group may have more of an untrained type population versus Hornsby's group is more of a trained population. So just something to consider when you are reading that literature. But we do have to note that there are different types of hypertrophy. Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is specific to our sarcolemmal volume and non-contractile elements. So really what this does is it's kind of a swelling of these different characteristics of our cells, but it may not necessarily contribute to force production. Versus myofibrillar is we are now thinking about the contractile elements in terms of our sarcomeres and protein abundance that actually contribute to force generation. And if you read further literature by Tabor shows that greater myofibrillar hypertrophy is going to help benefit strength for us. But a recent paper by Travis, and I encourage everyone to read it, is talking about task-specific hypertrophy in terms of benefiting strength power adaptations. Specifically, we're talking about benefiting our type 2 to type 1 ratio for strength power athletes. Now, how do you do that? Is you're working at higher intensities, but you may manipulate the way your sets and reps are performed. You know, our standard sets and reps that we typically thinking about are 3 to 4 sets of maybe 8 to 12 repetitions. What they are proposing is actually performing lower number of repetitions, but a higher number of sets. And the benefit of doing something like that is being able to work at a higher intensity. So you're still getting the volume, just with a different manipulation of sets and reps, but you're able to work at a higher intensity due to the quality that you're able to continue to perform. Now, if we're talking muscle architecture, what you're going to find in the literature is anytime you increase something like a pennation angle, if you increase cross-sectional area in a pennate type muscle, you're going to end up finding that the pennation angle is going to change. So something in terms of our angle may change from something in our yellow line here to our blue line. And what this does is it manipulates what's called the physiological cross-sectional area. So if we think about the anatomical cross-sectional area, it's literally if we draw a diameter across our muscle belly in the biggest part. But a physiological cross-sectional area is going to be the perpendicular angle to the angle of our muscle fibers. And what we end up doing when we have a pennation angle is we can, a greater pennation angle, we can pack more fibers or fascicles within one spot within the muscle belly. And when we do that, we actually increase the magnitude of force production that we may be able to produce. And as a result, we are setting our body up to gain more strength. Now, just to be clear, we may have these initial changes when we increase hypertrophy, but we don't actually get stronger until we train for strength. The other thing that we have to consider is the fact that there's some literature coming out from Walter Herzog's group that indicates that titin may actually be a third contractile filament on top of both actin and myosin. So really what this contributes to is the stiffness of our sarcomeres. Now, you could define stiffness loosely as the ability of our muscles to transfer force from the muscle to the bone. So coming through the tendon, right? Really what this does it stabilizes our sarcomeres and allows us to provide that initial force, because we're going to actually see titin going to bind to actin and help contribute to the force production that we end up having by creating a more rigid sarcomere. Now, when we have more rigid sarcomeres, we're able to transfer force more effectively. Now, neural factors, a lot of you are probably familiar with most of these, but think about motor unit recruitment. Based on Henneman's size principle, generally speaking, smaller motor units are going to be recruited first, followed by larger motor units. And the way that we can get these larger motor units and actually lower their threshold a little bit is with exercises that require high forces and high rate of force development. So if we think about exercises that are either going to be things like our squats, heavy exercises, or maybe our weightlifting movements that are going to be require high rates of force development, even lighter exercises that require high rates of force development and are ballistic, we can recruit more motor units. Our firing frequency or rate coding, ballistic type training is going to benefit this. Motor unit synchronization, but also neuromuscular inhibition. All of these are going to contribute to performance when it comes to gaining strength. Now, if we think about the couple goals that we have during a strength phase, it's not just increasing force production. We also are trying to increase something like rate of force development, because what that's going to do is then lay the foundation for other characteristics that we're going to develop, which is why you see a common trend here in terms of improving rate of force development in addition to the amount of force production that we're trying to produce. But the other thing that you're going to see with this type of literature is notice high forces, ballistic actions, high rate of force development. Anytime we have those types of movements, we are setting ourselves up to gain greater strength. And what we're going to get to here in a second is different strategies that we can use in terms of resistance training to gain strength. So some different methods that we're going to be talking about here is want to talk about kind of some basic methods that everyone can use, some common methods that you may not necessarily think about using, but also some advanced methods. And it's important to kind of address all of these because we all have different levels of athletes. And as a result, we need to be able to individualize our programs the best that we can. So this comes from a paper that we did in 2018. And really what this is a theoretical model of different methods of resistance training and what they can contribute to hypertrophy, strength, and power. But what you're going to see here, so just for clarification, a plus sign is an indication of potential. More plus signs indicates a greater potential benefit. So what you see here is anything from body weight exercise to kettlebells to bilateral training, unilateral training, etc. But what you're going to see here is there are several methods that we would classify as more advanced training methods. Now they may be advanced primarily because of the fact that you're not going to place a large emphasis on these with beginners. We need to be able to introduce these as a novel training stimulus later in their training, because if we introduce them too early, we can't use them for a novel training stimulus later. Also, most of these methods, or all these methods that are highlighted here with these green arrows, require a baseline level of strength before we can start to implement them and for us to get the greatest benefit out of them. So starting with something as simple as body weight. So body weight exercises kind of serve as our foundation. Everyone remembers when they first started to learn how to squat. Can you perform a body weight squat? Now, there are several advantages here. They're closed chain exercises. We can improve relative strength to a point, but the major disadvantages of this is they may lack a true strength stimulus, because the ability to overload that stimulus or provide an overload stimulus is that we're typically going to be increasing the number of repetitions that we are performing. And what that's going to do, it's going to increase volume, which is then going to increase fatigue and decrease power. And if our ultimate goal is going to be power output, we are limited here. We could alter how that movement's performed. So if we think about a push-up, we can elevate our feet a little bit, maybe elevate our hands on a bench. We can progress from bilateral to unilateral. But this last point, and I kind of laugh about it, and I'm sure you will too, is that one of the ways that we can overload these movements is gain weight and get heavier. Now, I'm sure a number of you work with athletes that you're probably not looking to gain weight with them. Okay, we're trying to maintain weight. Maybe we're trying to put on a little bit of muscle mass, but we are limited to this point in terms of how much body weight is going to contribute to our performance. Now, if we switch gears and talk about bilateral and unilateral, so we have different examples here. We have a back squat, which is your bilateral standard exercise, versus a rear foot elevated split squat, which is pictured here down in the bottom right. And what you're going to see is when you go through the bilateral and unilateral literature, is you're going to find that there's greater hamstring and quad activity during something like a rear foot elevated split squat compared to a back squat. And really, the reason behind that is it is less stable compared to a back squat. But what you're also going to see is that there's really no difference in strength and power tests after training with either bilateral or unilateral, meaning both of them can be used to train for strength purposes. Now, what's interesting to note, though, is that what they contribute to is typically going to be very specific. Unilateral training is going to transfer to unilateral gains, its specificity. Bilateral, you may improve more in your bilateral, but just realize that increasing unilateral strength can also increase bilateral strength. One other note here is that bilateral training seems to kind of hang on there a little bit longer in terms of the improvements that you gained. Now, other things is you may hear these arguments that with sports that require sprinting, jumping, change of direction, etc., that unilateral training may be more specific. So should we emphasize this type of training? Well, we can certainly include it, but is that really going to serve as our foundation? Well, recent literature has come out to say that bilateral training actually improves sprint and change of direction performance more than unilateral training. So the second point's really important, is really what the authors confirmed is that it really doesn't matter what exercise choice we're going to use, but we need to focus on the physiological stimulus, as we talked about previously, that drives the adaptation that we're trying to develop. So even if you have an exercise that's going to be quote unquote more specific to the movement that you're trying to develop, you need to focus on the neural stimulus or the hypertrophy type stimulus that you're trying to develop at the time. The second paper recently, this is a meta-analysis. Both bilateral and unilateral training are effective at improving horizontal movement. Not surprising, both of these are going to be producing a lot of force into the ground. But interestingly enough, unilateral movement, when you're talking about sprinting or change of direction, may not actually provide a better benefit. So again, we're talking about training the stimulus, or providing the optimal stimulus for your athletes rather than trying to make an exercise more specific. Now, I worked with a baseball coach whose definition of specificity was wearing a weighted vest and fielding ground balls. Now, we can't be overly specific with the exercises. We want to be specific enough in the weight room. Remember, we're training movements in the weight room. We're not training the sport itself. So something to note is greater stability can be provided when we're using bilateral movements. And what that does is it increases our ability to express force. So when we have lower stability, we're using lower loads, and therefore we have lower peak power and rate of force development. So just to be clear, I'm not saying don't incorporate unilateral movements. What I am saying is that bilateral movements may serve as your foundation, but we can also sprinkle in unilateral movements. I'm going to show you an example here on this next slide. We typically want to incorporate our unilateral movements, if we're going to incorporate them, in typically like a strength endurance phase or maybe a general strength phase. The reason why is we want to provide the biggest bang for our buck exercises when we get to something like a power phase. So here's our strength endurance phase. You can see that day 1 and day 2 are essentially, day 1 and day 3 are essentially the same, but what you end up seeing is a barbell split squat on both day 1 and day 3. You also see a dumbbell row on day 2. So these are unilateral exercises, but given the stimulus that we're trying to provide to the athlete, it makes sense to be able to add that extra volume during a strength endurance phase. So something like this could certainly be performed with maybe 3 sets of 10 repetitions. Now, if we move to a general strength, switching some of the movements is we have a barbell walking lunge. We get rid of the dumbbell row on day 2. Notice that we have a dumbbell row on day 3 now. So we can still incorporate a lot of the same movements or variations of these movements to still train strength. But something to note is something like a barbell split squat is going to be a more stable movement because both of those limbs are always on the floor together. Something like a barbell walking lunge, we've now added in a dynamic component, making it a bit more complex. So something like a strength endurance phase is going to have a higher repetition count compared to general strength. We just need to consider that when we are incorporating these movements together. Now, talking about plyos. Well, why are we talking about plyos when it comes to a strength stimulus? We are certainly limited in our capacity to provide a strength stimulus with plyos, but we also have to consider the fact that plyos, if implemented correctly, can benefit these underlying neural mechanisms that we had talked about previously. In addition to that, we have to think about the fact that we have an eccentric component to it, an isometric component to it, as well as the concentric. So recently, we put together a paper in 2019, but developed this type of model in terms of developing our plyometrics. So what plyometrics may be able to do is provide a unique eccentric overload stimulus. Remember, we have to be able to absorb or accept an external load before we can effectively transition it to a concentric movement. And as a result, the eccentric forces that we may experience may provide an actual strength stimulus, but also allow us to lay the foundation or start at a higher force output when transitioning to a concentric movement. Now, the instructions that we give our athletes are going to be very unique here, and we need to be specific. So if you go through and read the literature in plyos, we want to limit our time on the ground, but also jump as high as possible when performing a variety of these movements. But just realize as we continue to develop our athletes, we are shifting from being able to absorb force to transition from eccentric to concentric. So this slide here, just to give you a little bit more in terms of a progression, is you can see lower body strength levels. Now these are relative back squat numbers here. So we have greater than 2 times body weight, at least 1.5 times our body weight, or being able to squat our body weight. You can see here on the bottom variations from ground contact time, landing strategies that we may use, but also the function of our eccentric phase. So something to note is something as simple if we look bottom right here, where we're using a depth landing. Tall to short, also called snap downs. Something as simple as that for a beginner may be enough of a stimulus before we start to progress to other things. Maybe that's not enough for them. So now we have a depth landing in both categories of strength here, but just realize that the depth landing is going to become harder and harder because it needs to provide an overload stimulus for the athletes as they get stronger. Now, if we're talking about weightlifting movements, a topic near and dear to my heart, we can develop a lot of different characteristics here. And actually what you've seen in the literature is that training with weightlifting movements may provide better strength power benefits compared to a variety of other methods. But I also want to note that there are different characteristics that we have when we're talking about derivatives. So if we talk about the actual weightlifting movements themselves, the snatch and the clean and jerk. Typically, when we're training our team sport athletes or even individual athletes, we're going to be using derivatives that alter those movements a little bit. So something like a hang power clean in this video here is we have starting from a different position than from the floor, where we are able to use a moderately heavy weight. Now, if we're talking about a pulling derivative, we actually may start from a different position again, but now we're removing the catch phase altogether so that we can increase the amount of weight that we can use. So this is what we would consider a force dominant weightlifting movement. I'll play this one more time. Dipping into it, emphasizing that triple extension movement, but a high force movement, as you can see, 110 kilos here compared to 60 kilos. What we've ended up seeing just recently is that we may be able to provide a greater force and velocity overload stimulus with these pulling derivatives. The reason why is we can load them uniquely to provide a unique force and velocity stimulus. Now, what I will say is that it's not, we don't necessarily have to implement these by themselves. So what we may be able to do is we may be able to implement both weightlifting catching and pulling derivatives if you choose to. So catching derivatives are going to be limited in the load that we can provide, 50% roughly to about 100%. Remember, we can't catch over 100% of our 1RM. And we're probably not going to get a sub-maximal effort if we try to go below 50%. So pulling derivatives may serve as our primary strength stimulus as we start to develop these other characteristics. So what we've done recently is we put together kind of these progressions. If we want to progress to the floor with movements or with a hang, we have a variety here that will kind of lay the foundation as for our catching movements. So typically what I say to coaches who say, well, you don't want to catch ever, and it's like, that's not the case. What I'd like to do is provide my athletes with a proper strength power stimulus while I work on other characteristics such as the catch. Now remember, we can work on catching by doing drills on the side. We don't necessarily have to teach someone how to catch by just performing catching derivatives all the time. So again, a unique stimulus can be provided here with pulling derivatives. Now, Danny will be happy about this because I incorporated it. Thanks for his work on this, but isometric training. So we've now shifted gears from kind of the concentric part of our force velocity curve to kind of isometric. Isometric has been around for a long period of time, and what we end up seeing is most of the literature is focused on kind of these single joint type movements. And a lot more literature coming out with Danny and Ornichuk focused on kind of these multi-joint movements. So what we end up seeing with this type of training is we may be able to improve strength characteristics in terms of our force output, rate of force development, and tendon stiffness. And as we talked about previously, all of these are going to contribute to the amount of strength that we may be able to gain. Something to note, though, is that we may be specific in terms of our adaptations to the angles that we are providing. So you can see here in the picture on the right, this is an isometric squat being performed at a 90-degree knee angle. Typically, what we're going to end up seeing is the best adaptations right around that 90 degrees. But as we get either more shallow or more wide in terms of our angle, we may not see as much in our adaptations. Now, this last paper by Danny actually showed that really uniquely that in terms of how we perform the actions themselves, we need to make sure that we are providing a rapid muscle action no matter what. So we don't necessarily want to slowly ramp up. We want a high rate of force development in order to get those adaptations. But what we ended up seeing is that being able to sustain that for a little while will actually benefit us in the long run, because we're still trying to build that force as much as possible. So this is just one example of how you could possibly implement this. Now, something to note here is that our day 1 and day 2 are kind of our force dominant type days, while our day 3 is going to be kind of our recovery day over the course of the week. So if we take the previous recommendations of doing an iso squat, we can do it at 90, 120, sustained actions. So we could do something like that on day 1 and also be able to squat after that. If we did something like an isometric mid-thigh pull, we could actually use that as a potentiation mechanism to something like a counter movement shrug, which is what you just saw. So we can use these in a variety of ways, whether it's to kind of prime the nervous system at the beginning of a workout, but we could also use it as a potentiation mechanism as well. Okay, all of the strategies that we've covered up to this point have been kind of more basic, I should say. Anyone can perform low to moderate level plyometrics. Anyone can perform bilateral, unilateral type training. Weightlifting, certainly more complex, but the movements that we provide, if you're using pulling derivatives, can be pretty basic. In terms of isometric training, anyone can perform these, but I would like to classify these following as kind of advanced training methods. So talking about potentiation complexes, we are pairing 2 different movements to kind of accentuate or benefit the subsequent movement. Now, interestingly enough, most of the literature has been trying to potentiate kind of that explosive movement. So something like pairing a squat and a counter movement jump. There's a lot of mixed results, primarily because weaker individuals have been involved more in these protocols, but also some of the designs have not been very well done. What we ended up seeing, though, is that the amount of potentiation that follows these kind of potentiation complexes is enhanced after someone gets stronger. Great study by Miyamoto. And we actually did some literature project as well as sites that showed that individuals who squatted greater than or equal to twice their body mass potentiated not only faster, but they also potentiated more. So if that's a benefit that we're trying to get out of this, we may be able to use this as an advanced training strategy. So here's an example. We need to make sure that we are as specific as possible when designing these. So our force component, we use a concentric only half squat with ballistic intent. We used a squat jump, which is clearly a ballistic movement, but also notice the fact that how specific we were. Concentric only movements, ballistic intent, and we performed both of these at about a 90-degree knee angle. So just make sure that if you are going to be using potentiation complexes, make sure that you are going to be as specific to the movement as possible. Variable resistance training, something that was caught on for a little while, is using chains or bands. And what this is going to do is it's going to modify the force velocity characteristics of the movement. Specifically, if we're using something like chains, Chains are going to be heavier at the top of a movement compared to lighter at the bottom of the movement. So we may be able to receive kind of an early eccentric phase benefit from strength and a later concentric phase. Now, what we ended up seeing is greater strength gains with something like the back squat and bench press using variable resistance training compared to traditional training. Now, a benefit to something like this is it's unique. It provides a novel training stimulus for athletes who've never done it before, but it will also note that these can certainly alter technique, which is why individuals who are more experienced are probably going to benefit more from these types of movements. Now, an emphasis on eccentric training. We kind of mentioned plyometrics previously, but things like tempo training, flywheel inertial training, and AEL or accentuated eccentric training with things like weight releasers certainly can benefit positional strength, and maybe beginners would benefit more from tempo type training. Flywheel training, I will make note of you that we've done some pilot testing on this, and depending on how you perform that eccentric phase is really going to determine the type of stimulus that you end up getting overall. Lastly, with this accentuated eccentric, you may be able to use this in kind of a submaximal way or a supermaximal way. Submaximal example would be something like holding on to dumbbells, squatting down, dropping the dumbbells, and then jumping. Now, certainly more from a power benefit, right? But you can use AEL as kind of a strength benefit as well. So if you use supermaximal loading, something like 115% on the bar of your back squat max, well, 85% stays on the bar. So you go down with 115%, but 30% falls off and you come up with 85%. That benefit, that at least acute potentiation within the set is going to stick around for about 3 repetitions, according to John Wagle. But just realize that you may be able to get better force and rate of force development benefits eccentrically, which are then going to, if trained properly, benefit our concentric output as well. Something to note, though, with these eccentric methods is that they all exist on a spectrum. So movement on the spectrum, whether they're slow velocity movements or high velocity movements, is going to be dependent on either the exercise themselves, the load, or the technique that is used. So things like sprinting plyometrics, we know that these are going to be rapid velocity movements. Something like eccentric forces with sprinting, if you read Ken Clark's work, you may be able to receive up to about 5 times your body weight on a single leg. Squats, on the other hand, are going to be heavily loaded movements, but we're not moving that fast. So just realize that providing a spectrum to your athletes, or a range of intensities here, is going to be providing unique benefits to your athletes. Now, how do we implement this? It's going to be dependent on their strength, but it's also going to be dependent on their training year. This came from one of our papers recently, but just realize that the type of method that you implement with beginners, intermediates, and kind of advanced individuals is going to vary. Now, notice the number of asterisks following the plyometric training. This goes back to the previous model that we were looking at, where it's going to change based on their previous experience and how strong that they are. Something like tempo may be performed during the off-season phase of training, primarily because the time under tension is longer. If the time under tension is longer, that's creating more fatigue and not necessarily training the strength benefits or strength power benefits that we want. Now, this is just a very general training progression. We go from something like strength endurance to max strength to strength power before we peak these abilities. But what I want everyone to see is that strength is going to serve as our foundation. It's our foundation to benefit power output, to benefit our rate of force development, and ultimately these are the characteristics that we're trying to develop. Just realize that there's going to be a strength component regardless of the phase that we're going to be using. Now, weaker, less skilled athletes, I think this kind of goes without saying, but they're going to benefit more from gaining maximal strength. It's going to lay our foundation. And actually, there's been some previous work to suggest that focusing on resistance training before power type training is going to be more beneficial. Focusing on technique, and here are some methods that may benefit these individuals. Something to note here is there's different phases in terms of their strength development. Now, this is an example of a back squat relative strength. There's certain points where we kind of have a strength deficit, a strength association, until we get to that strength reserve where only gaining strength doesn't benefit our performance. We can still have strength as our primary exercise stimulus, but also we still want to consider the fact to sprinkle in those power exercises to start developing those rate of force development characteristics as well. Once someone gets to that strength reserve, we need to be able to provide a novel training stimulus, which is why I mentioned things like variable resistance training, higher intensity plyometrics, eccentric training can be provided as a novel training stimulus as long as we didn't give it to them too much earlier in their training. Stronger individuals, benefit here is those other exercises we looked at serve as our foundation. Fact of the matter is stronger individuals have more options. I like to say that stronger athletes get to play with more toys. Most of the time when we're talking about a basic strength training program is we're going to use the basics. We're talking about our bilateral movements, unilateral movements, but then when we start to get stronger and our technique is more solidified, we can focus more on things like potentiation complexes, variable resistance training, etc. I just want to touch on these as I finish up here. I know I'm starting to run low on time. These key training principles when it comes to developing strength are overload stimulus. Realize that an overload doesn't necessarily mean more and more and more weight. An overload can be an increase or a decrease in weight. It can be a new exercise or a new type of training method that you haven't used before. Really what it is any exercise stimulus that's going to produce an adaptation. Now, variation kind of goes without saying. We need to provide some variety to our athletes, but not too much variety. We need to be able to alter the training intensity so we're not flat loading them all the time. There should be increases in terms of heavier weeks. There should be lighter weeks, but adding variety is certainly going to benefit our strength development. And finally, specificity. We talked about specificity previously, and some examples to think about is when we are talking about an example like fencing. Fencing, you may be able to benefit from lunging type exercises. You may benefit from single leg plyometric exercise where you're going to landing up on a box. Ping pong, we can certainly benefit from, or table tennis, we can certainly benefit from lateral lunges, but also quick rate of force development movements. Specificity is going to be key. Do not try to be overly specific. When we do that, we start to try to train the sport in the weight room. Remember, we are focused on training movements in the weight room, not necessarily the sport itself. So some key points that I'd like you to take home from this talk. I realize this is kind of blunt, but we need to get stronger. Strength is going to lay our foundation. And really these weaker and less skilled athletes should be focused on gaining strength. And really what those mechanisms that we talked about early on can serve as our foundation. There are a variety of different methods that are out there. Just making sure that we take an individualized approach using our key training principles, we're going to benefit the most in terms of increasing our athletes' strength and their power output. So I'd like to again thank Danny, but also my research team, as well as the individuals that may not necessarily be at Carroll, my university, but individuals that I work with regularly. So again, thank you for your attention. And if we do have any time for questions, I think I gave myself about 5 minutes. So thank you again for your attention.
Tim, we absolutely have time for questions. There are none in the Q&A box at the moment, so welcome everybody to consider a question and drop it in there. But Tim, I lost count of my screenshots. That was such a cool presentation, a wonderful journey through the story of strength. I've got a question actually around the pull derivatives that you described. I mean, can we drop those into any training phase, or are they specific to a particular training phase? What are your thoughts on that?
How much time do you have? Honestly, no, that's a really good question. We believe personally, or I personally believe that we can implement those in really any training phase. So we just completed a training study that was 10 weeks long, where we had individuals performing pulling derivatives in a strength endurance phase with high volume. We did that with cluster sets just to make sure that the quality stayed high. We did that during a strength phase. We did that during a strength power phase. So to answer your question, they can really be implemented throughout the training year as long as they are focused on the goals that you're trying to develop. So again, if we're focused on gaining strength, we're going to use those exercises that are really force dominant, that the displacement of the weight may not be very large, but we can use heavier weights. But then we're going to shift that emphasis to something that would be, you know, a hang high pull or a jump shrug that are more ballistic type movements when we get to something like a strength power phase.
Okay, cool. Just another question here. When you describe overload, right, and that can be an increase or a decrease in resistance, what's an example of a decrease in resistance for the audience?
Sure. If we take a general strength phase, for example, so let's say we have 4 weeks of training, those first 3 weeks are going to be increasing in terms of intensity. And the 4th week is going to be a drop week where we back off the intensity. I say that an overload stimulus can be an increase or a decrease in weight, because what we're trying to do in those first 3 weeks is build the stimulus to force that adaptation. So as we build that stimulus, eventually we're going to get to a point where we kind of get to that exhaustion phase, where if we keep increasing, one, we're either going to train to failure, or two, if we do it too chronically, we may get to kind of that overtraining type stimulus. That being said, we need to decrease the weight, and what that's going to do is a couple things. One, it's going to help us recover, but the second thing is it may actually help us develop other characteristics that are important during that phase, something like rate of force development. So I believe I answered your question on that, but yeah, so increasing weight, decreasing weight can be a stimulus or an overload stimulus, but we may also have something like even volume can serve as an overload stimulus depending on the phase that we're in.
Very good, thank you. Getting some great questions through now, and I just want to maximize our time and squeeze out another one or two if
Sure.
I can. Thoughts on hypertrophy and strength being both independent or dependent variables? Any thoughts on that?
I believe they're referencing a specific paper that actually came out fairly recently. I do think they are related. I come from the school that when it comes to developing strength, I'm typically focused on developing some method of hypertrophy first, but making sure that that method is going to be task specific. So really emphasizing those type 2 motor units or type 2 fibers rather than type 1s. I do think, I can't say that they're fully dependent or one that's fully dependent on the other, because there's obviously neural mechanisms that are going to contribute to strength gain, not just muscle size and architecture, but I have a hard time believing that they're fully independent.
Okay, cool. Last question I'll ask you, Tim, and then perhaps I'll invite you just to reply.
Yeah, I'll pop in the Q&A.
Yeah, that's cool. Just regards, I mean, there's lockdowns going on all around the world at the moment. You know, Northern Hemisphere's going crazy. Athletes are being stuck inside. Unilateral versus bilateral stimulus and training to try and retain as much strength as possible. Any tips or tricks for athletes that might be in this position?
Find out what you can do body weight wise first, and then start to find other implements around your house. Because one of the things that I've actually told my athletes is even if they have things like a suitcase. You can add extra weight to it just by adding clothing, and you can be pretty creative with just a suitcase. But also, everyone has chairs typically around their house. You can change a bilateral movement to a unilateral movement. You can alter things like push-ups by, whether you're on a wall, whether, not necessarily working to single arm push-ups or anything like that, but you can be pretty creative with some things around the house. We think about kids. Kids are always performing plyometrics, whether they want to or not. If we have them running around, they're jumping off furniture, and it's amazing that their bodies can withstand what they do, but kind of that they're almost performing shock plyometrics at the time. But there's a variety of things around the house, whether it's plyos and, even if a strength power stimulus, I know we're getting a little bit off topic here, but the best thing you can do at that time to keep that strength power is sprint.
Train like a child. I like it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You gotta go back to the basics. They have the best squat form too. So
it's interesting watching children on the playground. It's a challenging time for athletes and S&C for sure. Trying to be creative and keep the gains flowing. But Tim, our time has come to an end. Sadly, I'd love to keep chatting with you. Been really good, really cool, really enjoyed it. If you could respond to a couple more questions in writing in the Q&A box down the bottom, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, sure thing.
Otherwise, just on behalf of everybody watching, 173 of us actually, great turnout, and just really heartfelt thanks for sharing all your knowledge today. Thank you.
Absolutely, I appreciate it. Thank you.
And so now we're going to flow straight into our next session. I'm going to pass the mic on actually to Hui Ying, who is going to take over. I'm going to slip away and have a cup of tea. And do a couple of things. So I will catch you all again a little bit later after lunch, actually. Have a light lunch, please. I want you nice and alert, because soon to be Dr. Danny Lum, who has helped Stevenson Lai put together this whole symposium. He's going to be up and on the mic after lunch, and it's going to be a good one. So I will be back to introduce that. Until then, keep learning, keep enjoying. Thank you.